excited to introduce our next speaker today. The keynote speaker for this year is Joe Wikert. Joe is the Director of Strategy and Business Development at Olive Software. Prior to joining Olive Software, he was General Manager, Publisher, and Chair of the Tools of Change TOC Conference at O'Reilly Media. And if you ever had a chance to go to that conference, it was an awesome conference. It was held in New York every year. I know a number of people in the room have been there. In addition to TOC, Joe managed each of the editorial groups at O'Reilly, as well as the Microsoft Press team, the retail sales organization. Before joining O'Reilly, he was Vice President and Executive Publisher at John Wiley & Sons in their PT division. He's also the author of the digital content strategy site, www.joewikert.com, where he shares his opinions about the digital content industry.
Thanks very much, Tim. And thanks to you and all of your colleagues for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. Really excited about this, and I've enjoyed just the first half day so far, and looking forward to more terrific sessions throughout the afternoon. Speaking of which, I'm hoping you guys didn't have too much of that toward me like I did, because it could knock you out pretty easily here. And I had Diet Coke to try to offset it, but we'll see what happens. So again, I'm thrilled to be here, and I know I bring a slightly different point of view to the table, and so I wanted to kind of start off a little bit with that, to tell you kind of a deeper dive into my background than maybe even what Tim just kind of went through there, just so you know where I'm coming from, and that in a lot of cases, maybe some of the things that I'm about to say maybe don't apply for you, but they're trends that I see happening in the broader digital content space. And so starting off with, I always like to refer to myself as a technology guy who somehow found his way accidentally into publishing. I was a software engineer for about 6 years, writing code for NCR, a company that does all the point of sale and ATM machines, if you've seen them out there. And I got to tell you, after about 5 years of this, 6 years, I realized that if I did this forever, I'd go nuts. I just was not the kind of person that could sit and write code 8 or 10 hours a day for 40 hours a week. So at the same time, I did some moonlighting, writing some books about technology and different technology topics. And then I shifted, because of that moonlighting work, into being a book publisher. So I worked for Macmillan, Prentice Hall, John Wiley & Sons, O'Reilly, as Tim mentioned. Did that for over 20 years. And then also, as Tim mentioned, ran the Tools of Change conference. I've obviously got a very strong bias towards the trade and reference side of things. So again, your mileage may vary when you think about some of the things that I'm about to share with you. I also pride myself, I guess, on being very opinionated and public with those opinions. So if you get a chance, be sure to stop by my website. I'd love to hear your comments and some of the things that I write about there, and also on Twitter. But when I left O'Reilly and when Tools of Change closed, I had the opportunity to kind of think about what I wanted to do next in my career. And really the goal that I had was to come full circle, go back into the software industry, and see if I could influence sort of the next generation of how content is being distributed digitally and consumed digitally. And so that's exactly what I feel like we're doing at Olive. Been there less than 2 years, coming up on 2 years this summer, and we've developed some really cool capabilities. And I'll touch on some of them throughout this broader keynote vision. And then if there's time at the end, I want to show you one of the capabilities we've created, which I think is really very exciting. So, as I said, I've got this bias towards trade, and when Tim and I talked about this keynote, we wanted to figure out, are there ways where we feel that trade is maybe a leading indicator of sorts for scholarly publishing? And I think that there are a number of areas where that is the case. And so, what I've done here is I've tried to identify, in this case, about 17 different points I want to make. And you'll notice my slides, I don't go detailed with bullets and so forth. There's just sort of the key point I want to make. We'll talk a little bit about that and see if it resonates with you. And again, even though there's 17 different points here, I feel like maybe the key role that I serve in this discussion today is really to be a catalyst. So even though you may not agree with some of these points or the directions and the trends that I'm pointing out, maybe it'll get you to start thinking about it and see how that affects your organization and what you want to do with content going forward. So again, I feel like I can serve as a bit of a catalyst with this. So, number one of the 17 here. I like to talk about how traditional containers go away. What does that mean? Well, the things that we think of as books and magazines and newspapers, by the way, they're going to outlive me, and so will print. I'm not one of these crazy people that says, oh, everything's going to E, and print is just going to disappear tomorrow. No way. Print is going to outlive me, my kids, my grandkids. It's going to be around for a long, long, long time. However, in the digital space, where I see things going is away from the containers, again, whether they're journals or books or what have you, into more what I'll call content streams based on the consumer's personal interests. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next few slides here. But I think this is a really important point because as containers go away, I think it really affects how we acquire and develop and distribute content. And you've got to be thinking less about what is this content going to look like, how's it going to be presented in today's container, and think more about how can this sort of stand on its own and be part of a digital stream. And I think it's also important to note that as the containers go away, the walls between the containers also start to erode. So in this case, for this audience, books and journals oftentimes are kind of considered separate. Well, as the containers start to erode, how do those types of content kind of intermix and coexist and so forth? And I realize some of that's happening already, but my point is that it's going to happen, I think, at an even faster pace going forward. Second, I'm a big believer that what we've got today with things like the EPUB format for ebooks and the version that Amazon uses, Mobi, for their ebooks, that those are sort of a short-term solution. And for those of you who are familiar with this, you realize, I'm sure, that EPUB, for example, is just a wrapper around HTML. And so, my belief, and I think what we believe at Olive, is that over time, those wrappers kind of disappear, and more content starts to get consumed directly in the browser. And so that's exactly how we're building our content consumption applications, is right within the browser. So it takes away from the need for plugins, let's say, to applications or third-party application downloads. And I guess the thing I find most fascinating about this is, you look at a standard like EPUB, and even EPUB 3, it gives you limited access to what HTML itself allows. So the underlying technology is more powerful than this wrapper that sits one abstracted above it. And so again, that's why I believe that over time, we start to go back more into a browser, a direct browser consumption model. And again, just like print's not going away, there's EPUB, there's Mobi, there's some big, high walled gardens out there that are very much entrenched and protected, and they want to see things like these wrappers stick around as long as possible. But I think gravity over time is going to pull us more into a content consumption model that's direct in the browser. Third, readers demanding a more powerful search capability. So the analogy I love to use here is I've bought over the years a lot of books from Amazon on the Kindle. More recently, though, I have to admit I shifted to the Oyster Books subscription model. Anybody familiar with Oyster Books? If you're not, you got to take a look at it, especially if you're a voracious reader like my wife. I'm a slow reader, okay? So we share a subscription. We pay, I want to say, $10 a month, and it's an all-you-can-read model. And you won't find the New York Times bestsellers there. You typically won't find a lot of recently published frontlist titles. But it serves a great need. And I'll tell you what, since we've been subscribers for about a year, I think we've got maybe 2 or 3 books on Amazon, and we would do that in a month in the past. So shifting over to that subscription model, I think, has had a profound impact on our content consumption habits. But what I find, whether it's the Oyster Reader app, the Kindle app, the Nook app, which I used for a while, and any other type of ebook reader app out there, I'm amazed at how simplistic the search is. And you see this even with a tool like Microsoft Word. You've got a 100-page document open, you do a search, and what you get back is just from page 1 to the end of the document, these are all the places where that phrase occurred. Now think about that if the web worked that way. And that if Google, when you typed in a phrase, the search results, all they showed you were the oldest websites where that phrase first appeared to the most recent ones. It would be totally worthless, right? And yet that's what we've kind of grown accustomed to with so many reading applications. Well, my point here is that I think over time, consumers are going to demand as powerful a search capability within all of their digital reading applications as they get, let's say, with Google. So there's going to have to be an algorithm that's very well tuned to the consumer's needs. And really, ultimately, I guess what I'm really getting at here is that the search results won't be a dumb repeat of from page 1 to the end of the document, but rather they'll be relevance weighted, okay? So we know, for example, when we process content with our platform at Olive, how many times the word appears on the page. We know whether that phrase appeared in the headline versus the body of text, whether it's in a table, a caption, what have you. We roll all of that into our algorithm. So when you do a search within our application in the browser, you're getting 2 views of the search results back, 2 lenses you can look at them. One is that from page 1 to the end, sort of chronological search. The other one is the weighted factor, relevance-based. And we find, because we serve up a lot of content to hundreds of newspapers, for example, that consumers really love that approach. And it helps them find what they're looking for, probably above the fold in the search results, rather than having to find that needle in the haystack. So I think over time, we're going to see more and more applications embrace more of a relevance-based search results. And I think for the type of content that this group produces, that has got to resonate pretty well too. But I want to take this even a step further and say that when I'm in an ebook application, I'd love to have that relevance-based search result. But more importantly, what I would like to do is have some kind of an application that's following me around everything I do. And I know this sounds scary, especially if you're a privacy advocate, but looking at what I'm doing on the web, looking at what I'm doing when I drill further into different sites, looking at my ebook applications, looking at my Whisper subscription, and it's indexing all of that. And so now, at the end of the day, it can help me answer that question that I've asked a million times, and that is, where did I read about that again? You know, somebody will tell me, did you see the story about so-and-so? It's like, yeah, I know I saw that somewhere, but I can't remember where. I need that kind of service, and it's going to come from search, and it's going to be powerful. It's sort of like an Uber search that looks at everything that you're doing, everything that you're touching over the course of the day. Next up, 2 of my favorite phrases here, print under glass and dumb content on smart devices. I feel like this is where we are today in the world of ebooks. You know, it amazes me to think about the fact that ebooks, whether, again, Kindle, Nook, whoever you're getting them from, they're nothing more than a digital replica of the print edition. And they don't take advantage of the capabilities of the digital device that we read them on. And so that's where, you know, I like to think of it as it is just print under glass, and it's wasting the power of my iPad, for example, because it doesn't really have any sort of additional services that are allowing me to take advantage of the iPad itself. And then, you know, dumb content on smart devices. This, whether it's search that I just talked about or some of the other capabilities that I think are going to really sort of float to the top in the future here, I think over time, we're finally going to get to the point where this content we're producing is as dynamic and powerful and leverages, whether it's the web or other types of resources out there, that we just don't see today. And again, I get it. I was a publisher for many years, and I saw how easy it was to simply just go from print to e, get, you know, at some point, I think about 20% of my revenue from ebooks without having to hardly lift a finger. But I think at some point, we're going to have to see the market evolve before that. And, you know, one of the great analogies I like to use here is the early days of television. And I wasn't around then, I'll admit that, but I've heard that the first TV shows were nothing more than radio programs in front of a camera. Think about that. How far have we evolved since then? Well, I would argue that we are at that same stage with ebooks today, for example, where today it's a very simplistic model. Hopefully 3, 5, 10, 15 years down the road, we're going to look back and think how quaint it was way back then, and how we evolved with the marketplace, and really started to, again, take advantage of the devices and the power that we got there. And I think that comes from a number of different approaches, by the way. You know, one of the things I like to think of as a future model is a deluxe edition. So just kind of dream with me for a moment about a publisher that sells their static editions today through all the existing retail channels that they have partners with. But then they create this deluxe edition that they sell only direct. And they do that direct fulfillment because they want to have that direct relationship with the customer. They want to be able to mine that relationship and take it further. And so I think that, especially in the trade world, there's a huge opportunity for publishers to do that and use actually the indirect sale to power and lead to the deluxe edition that's only available in a direct fashion. Now, again, that is a dream because you've got some of the major players out there that it's not in their best interest to allow that to happen. But I think that over time we're going to see more of that. One of the other deterrents, though, to this is publishers that have experimented, let's say, with enriched content or enhanced editions. And I was there, I fell into that trap too. We spent a fortune on native applications. First we'd create the iOS version of it and be all proud of it, and then quickly we're told that, hey, you realize that's only about half the market, you gotta go back and create this Android edition. Next thing you know, we realize, hey, we can't even really use most of this code, we gotta start from scratch, and now it's 2 times the original investment to have it on both of those platforms. All the while, we've disrupted our production workflow, our editorial workflow, created these one-offs that aren't scalable, spent, in many cases, more money than we actually saw in revenue that came back in. My point here is that ultimately this is going to have to be, I think, a lightweight model that allows publishers to take advantage of their existing workflow and just sort of piggyback on that to add additional elements and to really create these deluxe editions. And that's what I want to demo for you towards the end. And by the way, I don't intend this to be a pitch or anything for what we do. There's others out there that are probably doing the same thing or will at some point. I just want to expose the capability to again, be the catalyst that I talked about before. Next up, gathering and making data actionable. Well, you know, it's one thing, and I separate this because it's pretty easy to gather the data, but it's a whole other thing to actually do something with it. And we live in this era of big data, and we hear so much about it, and there's even conferences and books and everything else out there that I think the industry needs to pay attention to. And of course, as we move more from print to digital, we have access to even more and more data, particularly if you're dealing directly with your customer, right? If you're going through a retailer, I used to joke when I was the publisher at O'Reilly, I would go out and meet with Amazon every year, and I would tell them, and I'd sit across the table and I'd say, look, I know you're gathering all the data about my readers on your Kindle platform, and you're not sharing it with me. So at what point am I going to have to start paying you for that data?
Yeah.
And they're going to charge, right? You know, and maybe, for all I know, since I've been a publisher for a couple of years, maybe they started doing that. There again, another great reason to really create that compelling direct channel and have that data for yourself. But I think back also to when I was with another publishing house, we used to put these insert cards in the back for registration and encourage customers to fill them out, in the days of print, and send them in to us. And maybe there was some like drawing or something that you'd be part of by doing that. I was just shocked and mortified one day to learn that all those cards were being kept in an open office, and they were just like slowly filling up to the ceiling. Nothing was being done with them. They were just sitting there. That's why I don't name the name, because I don't get anybody in trouble here. But it was amazing, but it reminds me that that's probably just one example of how there was data being gathered, but nothing was really being done with it. Another example of this, I think, that's really interesting. I was speaking at a conference a couple of weeks ago in New York, and there was a gentleman from Cengage there talking about their e-application and how they've got access to all the data and analytics that it's powered by. And he said that one of the things they discovered early on is that students that tended to highlight a lot of content also tended to do worst on the tests. I mean, that kind of scared me too, because I thought, wow, I'm a big highlighter. Not as smart as I thought. Because he said really the conclusion that they drew was that these people are just like quickly going through and not reading and not engaging with the content, but just highlighting it so that they could go back and maybe cram before the exam and hopefully be street smart about it. And it just wasn't working out. Well, I think that's great that they're gathering the data, but now there's sort of another step beyond that. What are they going to do with that data? My advice would be, okay, how can you use that to give feedback to the student to say, it's great, that you're doing all this highlighting, but we found that X% of people that do this much highlighting really struggle maintaining the concept. So why don't you prove to yourself that you really learned this? Here's a pop quiz for you. That sort of thing, right? To really reinforce the learning experience. I mean, there's other people would probably have many, many other better ideas to try to leverage that data. But my point is that gathering it is kind of the easy part. Now, making it actionable and doing something meaningful with it, I think is really important. Adaptive content. And I realize this is probably a dangerous phrase to use because it means different things to different people. And my definition of adaptive probably doesn't mesh with yours. I'll come clean with that. When I think of adaptive content, I think, going back to the analogy I used before, of an application or a device that basically is always looking over my shoulder, always knows what I've read, knows where I've struggled, knows what I need to try to learn next, that's using that sort of machine language capability to really help craft what I should be focusing on going forward as I read. And another way of doing that, I would say, is I used to publish how-to books on technology topics. So every time Microsoft released a new version of Office, we would sell a ton of copies of books on Excel because they changed, the menu structure or some other features and functionality. Well, what I would like to do is have an application that knows what I know about Excel. Knows that I'm pretty good at pivot tables and formulas, but maybe knows that I also have never really even discovered some of these other features. And so over the course of me opening up this book, whatever you call it, I'm having maybe a different reading experience than somebody who is just starting out with Excel. Even though the foundation of the content is identical, it's being kind of remixed and delivered in a totally different manner based on who I am and what this application knows about. And again, I know that can be kind of scary to some folks to think about that sort of monitor taking place all the time in the background. But I think that we're heading towards a model like that, and I think it can be really useful and helpful. I think it's also a great discovery tool. So as I said with that Excel example, there may be capabilities within Excel that I just haven't even looked at because they haven't crossed my path yet. But with a tool like that, I think that it could be a really great way to discover. And it also would help take us beyond that dumb content on smart devices, right? So in that case, a book that adapts to who I am and what I know, and maybe even suggests some things that I should look at, wonderful. I think it's a great way to increase engagement as well as help people learn new things. Customer as curator. I love this one because you go back to the Wikipedia as an example, and that's an extreme example, right, where anybody can basically do any changes. And I'm not suggesting that that's right for everybody, but I think that you can create different levels of customers as curators. Maybe there's sort of a select list, let's say, of subject matter experts that you trust to be able to go in and help shape your content, make it better, add to it, and so forth. Another example I like here is, when I read a business book, for example, and I then see a few months later that something like Bill Gates read the same book, I would love to know what he thought of that book. What were the notes that he took? And if you follow Bill Gates much, you'll learn that he reads a bunch of books every year and then he kind of picks his top 10, publishes his list, and says why you should read them. Wouldn't it be cool, though, if a guy like Bill Gates, and that's just one example, could create almost like a celebrity edition of the book? So now this is the version that has all of his little annotations, and now I can buy that. And maybe I'm willing to pay a bit more for that than I would the standard book because I'm getting insight from Bill Gates. So you might be thinking, well, that's all well and good, but why would Bill Gates do that? Well, number one, I think he's already reading the book. Number two, he's probably taking notes. Number three, he doesn't need the money. We all know that, right? But what if the royalties for his part of that went to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation? It's a great way for him to expand his philanthropic activities, right? So celebrity editions, subject matter experts, when I think of this audience, there's got to be a whole bunch of subject matter experts in each of the topic areas that you guys work in. Are there ways to create sort of deluxe editions that have, again, this additional layer of content on top of what the author put in there that you could sell as kind of an add-on? Realize, by the way, I'm oversimplifying a lot of this. There are rights issues, there's buy-in with authors and so forth. Some authors have never agreed to this. I totally get it. Others, though, might be really up for it and wanting to bring folks in and add that additional content. So that's, I think, another way to look at this. Another service which you're probably familiar with, Hypothesis. Are folks familiar with that? Yeah. And I'm one of the last to discover, I guess, just recently, and started playing around with it. What a cool tool! What a neat way. I've wanted this forever. The ability to go into a web page, make notes to myself, share it maybe with others, but mostly have kind of private notes so I can go back to that question I asked before. Where did I read this? Right? And then have my notes right there on the page. That's a great example, I think, of customer as curator. And I think we're going to see more and more of that going forward. Better and more powerful collaboration. This gets back a little bit to the last slide of the customer as curator. In this case, I think reading groups are going to become more prevalent. The old book club, for example, that many of us have been part of, in some respects sort of went away with the digital era, but maybe not so much. Well, I think what we're going to see more here is just that there's a lot of live collaboration happening with the book. So it's one thing to meet on Wednesday nights and share your thoughts on chapter 7 of whatever this book is you're reading. It's another thing to have the social layer built in to the reading application, so that as I'm going through this, I see what my 7 other friends have already said about it. Turn it on and off. Maybe I want to have a very clean reading experience, so I'm not sort of confused by their thoughts, and I let it kind of process in my own mind first, and I can flip it back on and see their opinions before we ever do meet on Wednesday nights. But no, I think the key takeaway here is that there becomes, I think, an opportunity for a lot more collaboration at each stage. So authoring, editing, and then even during the reading process. I think we'll see more and more applications taking advantage of that with deeper social built in. And again, you've got the incumbents and the leaders out there that don't really want to see that happen outside of their own walled garden. There was a great service. Anybody ever heard of findings.com? Wonderful startup about 4 years ago that used to allow you to go in, kind of like Hypothesis, and make notes on web pages. But the other cool thing they did was they allowed you to share your Kindle highlights and comments with the community. And Amazon did block those off. Well, that didn't last long. The big guys in Seattle got wind of that and shut them down in no time. But I do think that, again, there's going to be other startups and other vendors out there that will create ways to share that kind of information. Content reuse and redeployment. It was really fascinating listening to that session first thing this morning and hearing the various pros and cons of copyright and CC BY and so forth. And it really makes you think of how complex that is, especially when the more we get into the digital space, e-content just lends itself so much for remixing and redeployment. And I think that there's going to be such an enormous market around that going forward. It's only going to grow in importance. It gets back to the very first point I made of containers going away. If you've got your content in a repository that allows you to selectively pull from it and manage it, push it out into different formats, it becomes really powerful. Here's a great example. I didn't mention this, but at Olive Software, where I work, we generate the bulk of our revenue today in the periodical space. So newspapers, for example, we power hundreds of daily editions, the digital replica editions of these papers. So Cox, McClatchy, Hearst, Tribune, they're all partner publishers of ours. What we're doing is we created a tool called Collection Book that allows these publishers to go into their archives and do searches and pull out just the pieces and parts of content on a particular topic. So for example, we're working with a paper in Georgia, the Masters that just ended, to help them create an ebook around summaries of the various Masters tournaments from over the years. So maybe you've got a chapter from 2015, another from 2014, and so forth going backwards. Well, they couldn't do that on there because they're in the business of just creating the newspaper every day, and they don't really think about the evergreen nature of a lot of their content. So again, ours is just one solution there, but I think the ability to take that content that was originally intended for a print newspaper and to be able to remix it and redeploy it as an ebook. When you look at this, by the way, look at this sample that we created for them. It doesn't look like it started as a newspaper. It looks like it was born digital, and it's really pretty powerful stuff. But I do think we're going to see more and more of that. And I know that you guys have already experienced a lot of that, but I think that's going to continue to increase. Lifelong learning. This subject just scares the heck out of me, to tell you the truth. I mean, I think about the generations in my family. I think about my parents, and I realize that I don't even think this phrase was in their vocabulary. They never really thought about it. I mean, they basically did more or less the same jobs their entire careers, and they weren't all that affected in their lives by the digital disruption that I think all of us have been going through the last 10 years, let's just say. So then I think about myself, and I realize, gosh, I've really had to sort of reinvent myself a few times over the years. Again, being a software engineer, getting into publishing, then publishing goes from print to digital, having to learn all that, stay on top of all the latest trends. That in itself oftentimes can be a full-time job, right? Well, now I think about my kids. So I've got a daughter who, she's a speech pathologist. I've got a son who is an engineer from Purdue in aeronautical engineering. And I've got another daughter who is in undergrad right now to be a counselor for children in need. And I think about what they're going to have to learn, each of them a little differently over the course of their careers, and it's just amazing. I think lifelong learning is going to have to be just part of their daily activities, just for survival in the marketplace, right? And interestingly enough, I don't know how many of you saw that acquisition last week that LinkedIn made of lynda.com. Anybody familiar with that? Really smart, I think, on behalf of LinkedIn, because again, that video training that Lynda brings to the table only helps make LinkedIn a more powerful platform, getting back to this concept of lifelong learning. So LinkedIn's building, their own walled garden of sorts, and hoping that you stay there not only as you build your career, but as you network, and then as you look to further your career. So I think a really important point to keep in mind. Content recommendation and the concept of this content concierge. Serendipity is such a different topic when you think about digital. Again, coming from the trade publishing world and knowing that we used to talk about stacking them high and deep, Barnes & Noble and Borders when they existed. That was the way to market books. And how simple is that now, right? And then Amazon kind of dominated, and we had a different way of promoting it. So you had to buy space on a landing page or buy placement in an email blast. But still, it wasn't the serendipity that you would have in wandering through the bookstore. I always felt that when you're in a bookstore, there's I think less, you may be going there with a particular title in mind, but I don't know about you, I often wound up walking out with not only that one, but 2 others. I almost never do that online. I go in and I go out, it's truly just a destination purchase. And so you think about how does impulse buying come into play in the digital world? I'm finding I'm not doing a whole lot of it. So how do you tailor sort of the content recommendation out there and increase that serendipity that needs to happen to really continue the flow of content and the discovery of content, which is such a popular phrase. It's got to be beyond those email blasts. It's got to be beyond what a lot of retailers do with buy X, get Y. I didn't know that existed, so I'll get that. But getting back to what I talked about before, where I have that monitor that constantly focuses on exactly what I'm doing throughout the day, knows what my needs are, maybe anticipates them before I do, and starts thinking about the type of content that I want to see. And that leads me to this notion of content concierge. It was brought up earlier today in one of the sessions that, hey, I don't need more content coming at me. It's already like a fire hose, and I totally understand that. What I need is a better filtration system. And not just limiting content, but really telling me what I need to focus on. So if we go back again to that example I said of a monitoring application that knows more about me maybe than I know about myself, but is also looking at other people out there that are like me and finding things that maybe they liked and serving those up and helping me discover them in a very, I think, well-formulated manner, like a hotel concierge, but in this case with digital content. And not only would I love that, I would pay for that because I think it could help make me smart. So I think that is going to be a big part of the future too, is how content recommendation evolves in the years ahead. Sponsorship revenue. This is one of these really sensitive topics that, probably as long as 6 or 7 years ago, is to talk about how I saw a model where ebooks might be given away for free, and an ebook would be filled with ads, or would be a sponsor. I'll tell you what, I almost got thrown out of a few rooms for even suggesting that from the purists out there. They're like, oh, we can't have that, that's just not how the world works. We're starting to see that creeping in a little bit, though. We're starting to see more sponsorship of content, whether it's books or other types of content out there. And I think the walls, again, will start being torn down, and we'll see more content where the sponsor felt like it was worth their while to get their name, their brand, their messaging in front of this particular target audience. And therefore, I think it's going to become, a lot more popular. And it's, by the way, it's not for everybody. I realize that. There are some publishers that are just going to completely shun this idea. But I think one of the cautions of this is, even though you may reject the idea for your organization, that doesn't necessarily mean that your competitors will too. So just something to be thinking about. Print versus digital. And I find the interesting part of this, the fact that it's always referred to as either mutually exclusive. You're doing one or the other. And I think maybe that's part of where we dropped the ball in ebooks. So not only the static ebooks, that dumb content on smart devices that I talked about, but also thinking of digital completely separate from print. I think one of the areas that really has yet to be exploited, and I don't think there's been a whole lot of thought given to this, is how can print complement digital, and how can digital complement print? So in other words, working with a textbook publisher right now, I'm talking about how, they're actually working with their print vendor, who obviously doesn't want to see the print business go away, right? So it's in their best interest to keep that going. So what we're trying to figure out is how can they use our tools and capabilities to create a digital companion to that print product that can make the whole learning experience more powerful. So whether that's taking part of the content with the student, maybe having access to a bigger chunk of it than I'm envisioning, having that social layer built in, I don't know. I mean, we're just on the fringe of this right now. But I think that over time, we're going to see more and more use cases pop up where it's not either or, but they're being thought of together. How can digital be used to complement print? Subscription models. I talked a little bit earlier about Oyster. Scribd is another competitor there, SCRIBD, if you're not familiar with them. Those were sort of the two pioneers, and then Amazon kind of copied them, knocked them off with Keynote Unlimited. So I think that's $10 a month as well. You can get access to hundreds of thousands of titles there. So it's a question of renting versus owning. And as I mentioned, my wife and I have an Oyster subscription. And I don't think either of us feel bad at all to know that we're a year into this, and the books that we've read, if we were to drop the subscription, our access to those books goes away. Now, a lot of the content that you guys produce is more timeless and probably something that people want to own outright. Not everything, I realize, but some of it perhaps more so than the type of content my wife and I tend to read. So it's not for everybody again. It's not for all consumers, but certainly I think we're going to see more and more consumers warming up to the notion of renting content versus owning it. But I guess one of the cautions here is the value proposition. And I'll use myself as an example, and not written content, but actually music. Spotify. I've been using Spotify for a few years, never paid a penny for it. And then around Christmas, I saw that they had a deal where for 99 cents, I can have the full paid version that normally costs $10 a month. You can have that for 3 months for 99 cents one time, so 33 cents a month. Now, I'm a tightwad cheapskate. I figured, this is worth it. I'll give it a shot. And if I like it at the end of 90 days, maybe they'll be successful in getting me to cough up $10 a month, although I doubt it. Well, it turns out I was right. I loved it for those 90 days, but as I got closer and closer and the clock was ticking down towards that 90th day, I realized that the free version was good enough. And so I opted out and drifted right back into that. And in the grand scheme of things, of the millions of people that use Spotify every day, Spotify's already obviously crunched the numbers, and they know that there's some number of people out there that are just like me, and they're fine with that, and they're trying to monetize that stream through advertising. Although, let's face it, it's got to be a fraction of the income versus the $10 a month they would get, right? So, in that case, what I discovered was that if you make your free version too good, it can really backfire. Now, you guys probably already knew that, and maybe Spotify's baked that in. They decided that people like me are in the minority, they don't really care about me, and that's fine. But it was a really important point, I think, for me to really understand. Also on this, I guess I want to say that subscription models really open the door for those containers to go away, right? So, again, being an Oyster subscriber, right now I have access to books, just books. At some point, I'd like to think that there's going to be magazines rolled up, maybe other content behind the paywall that's more digital. Maybe the price goes up, and there's different tiers, and that's fine, and I would certainly look to subscribe to that. But I don't think these subscription models that I'm seeing, at least today, on the book side, are always going to be just books. Containers start to go away, and they become, I think, a lot more interesting here. So we're in the early days, no question about that. I think we're going to see more evolution there. So there was a great study done, I'm sure you guys probably read it long before I did, about the failure of e-textbooks and why college students, for example, don't like them and why they still prefer print. And I read the summary of the report, and I kind of came away scratching my head thinking, well, I get this sort of, but I really felt like they overlooked a few things. So, first of all, you've got a situation where they're talking to college students who grew up with print, and they used print textbooks all through high school. Do we really think that they're going to flip over and change to digital, just like that in college? I don't think so. I think that would be foolish to think that. Secondly, one of my big complaints with ebooks is that they're just like print, but with less benefits. Right? So, when I finish reading an ebook, I can't give it to my friend like I can a print book. And I think that that's just one example of some of the limitations that get in the way here. Then you've got prices, right? There's no compelling reason if the print textbook is $100 and the e-textbook is about $100. There's nothing really to sway me there. And let's not lose sight of the fact that in the ebook world, really what served as the catalyst there was that Amazon introduced this Kindle, which had this whisper sync technology to bring the content down, which was great, but also they were low pricing everything, right? So all books initially were $9.99, even if it was like a $30 trade book. And so that really helped gain or start the momentum there. So I think, the fact that prices are the same, almost, there are exceptions certainly, but 10-20% differential isn't going to be enough, especially if you don't have the ability to pass it along to a student in the next class. The other thing that I really loved about that was this point of some students saying that, gosh, when I'm on my tablet or my computer or my phone, there's just too many other digital distractions. I could go to Facebook and I'm thinking, man, if that is really the problem here, what a sad commentary on the next generation, I mean, they can't focus enough on reading to be able to ignore Facebook for a little bit. And then I realized, well, it's not even just that. I mean, if they're sitting there reading the print textbook, isn't their phone right next to them anyhow? Isn't it kind of a distraction over there? So that one didn't really stick with me too much. And then, you've also got what I said before, this user experience of print under glass, and then just, the dump content on smart devices. Until there's a compelling reason to make that switch, of course, I don't think these students are going to really embrace ebooks in any significant way. The Internet of Things and the different predictive analytics and how they can lead to content and content opportunities. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Internet of Things and the fact that these various devices that we have. My Android phone has a ton of different, basically a gyroscope, a motion sensor, a light sensor, all these different sensors that are built in. Now I have a Fitbit, and I kind of chuckle at this because this is what a GPS was 10 years ago before the smartphone came along. Remember, we all had GPSs that did one thing and that was it. That's all this thing does. At some point, and it's going to happen sooner rather than later, we're not going to be wearing these things. It's just going to all be in our phone, and Apple's obviously taking us down that direction to begin with. But what I find fascinating about the Internet of Things is how there's going to be sensors and devices in just about everything. And so think for a minute about, let's say you're in the how-to publishing world, and maybe you create content on home repairs for plumbing, or even working on your car. All these sensors that are going to find their ways into your plumbing, your electrical systems at home, and your vehicle. What if they're not only monitoring what's happening, but they're predicting that, hey, Joe, you haven't rotated your tires, and so it's time to do that. Please go ahead and do it. And oh, by the way, here's a nice video on how to do it yourself. Oh, what are you laughing at? I don't think I can do that. I'm offended. I have done that. So that's just one example, though, of how you can serve up content through all this data that comes in through these various devices and sensors that are out there. And so again, I realize it's probably a little different in your worlds, but I'll bet sensors are going to touch on a lot of what each of you are doing as well. So just want you to be thinking about that. This is the last point here, and this, by the way, I love this. I don't know if you can read that or not, but it's an ad for Uber on the back of a New York City bus. And I thought, how clever is that, And it's not about becoming an Uber driver. It's about, instead of getting on the stinky, smelly bus, why not get into a nice, clean Uber vehicle? And I thought it was amazing that the New York Transit Authority was okay kind of promoting their competition here. But what it really did for me is it gave me a visual to go with the point that I like to make of having your indirect channels feed your direct channel, right? So using your indirect partners as a marketing platform for your direct efforts. So one of the things that we used to do when I was at O'Reilly, and this was, I guess, kind of a well-kept secret, but we used to talk about it openly, and it was changing every year, is in every ebook that we sold, whether it was from us or Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere in the world, the first thing that somebody saw when they opened that up was a greeting that said, hey, thanks a lot for purchasing this, and I'm glad that you own this. By the way, did you know that for $4.99 you can go to our website and register your purchase? And now, let's say you bought that as a Kindle book and you have the Mobi version. When you register it, one of the benefits you get is you also get the EPUB version, you get the PDF, and you get all updates to that book. Okay, so for $5, registering it, now you get all these nice benefits, and you're not locked into one reader application. So bought it for my Kindle, but maybe I want to read it in iBooks on my iPad. I can do that now by paying $5. That was an enormously successful campaign for us, and I believe they're still doing it. And by the way, truth be told, there was never any sort of security or authentication with that. We just figured that if we could get you to come in and pay that additional $5, now we've got not only another revenue stream because you've already maybe bought the book first, but now we can market to you as well. And so in that case, we were using the indirect channel as a way to bring consumers direct, building our base up and also selling more products, just like Uber's doing on the public buses here. So that's the end of what I wanted to go through in the slide deck here, although, I would argue it's just the beginning. And these 17 things that I talked about are really just scratching the surface. There's probably another 17 out there that a person smarter than me will be able to come up with in a heartbeat. But these are the ones that kind of floated at the top for me. And again, I would like to think that even if you've had an allergic reaction maybe to what I just showed you, that there's an opportunity to kind of think it through and maybe consider how it applies in your organization and talk with your colleagues about it as well. So I want to thank you for that part of the presentation there. And I think we've got maybe a few minutes left for me to show one of the capabilities that we've spun up here. So let me jump into that here. This is all my contact information, by the way. Feel free to email me or visit my website, and let's connect on Twitter as well. But let me go into my browser here, and in about 3 minutes or less, I will show you one of the cool things we're doing to help publishers take static content and turn it into really dynamic content. So kind of hard to read here because I guess we've only got VGA connection, there's no HDMI, so you don't have to read the text, just know that this is Thoreau's The Maine Woods. And what we did was we took a sample of like the first 20 pages into our platform and put it into what we call our Smart Layers technology, where we enable an author, an editor, basically any type of a curator to go in after the fact, once the content is published, and be able to add more layers of digital content to it. So this is our ebook application. It's in kind of a horizontal scrolling mode for presentation. Obviously, you'd never want to read a book this way, but as I scroll through, you see you get through the front matter and then into the forward and so forth. Right now, what you're seeing is the static version, just like you'd see on a Kindle, for example, so nothing special here. That's because I've got the Smart Layers button toggled off. When I turn that on, the book basically comes to life, and all the elements that were added now show up. So here, assuming I've still got Wi-Fi, when I hover over this button, it gives me a tooltip that says if I click there, I'm going to get taken to a website with famous Thoreau quotes. So if I click on it, now it opens up in my browser to that page. I can navigate there. When I'm done, I just close and go back into the book. I mean, nothing special there, right? It's just a link within the book. Here is another website. This is about the author of the foreword. It's presented a little differently as a slider panel coming in from the side. When I'm finished reading that, I can go back into the book. This one's the one that always gets me most enthusiastic, because what I've done is I've taken the Thoreau Wikipedia page and I've docked it within the book. Okay, so again, remember, as a static book, it was just a blank page. And when I turn Smart Layers on, now you can see it's not just a snapshot of this. This is actually a browser now within the book. All right, so I can scroll through. I can click on links. I can navigate further, in this case, into the Wikipedia without ever having left that page of the book. Okay, and I can navigate back just as easily. All right, and there's other enrichments here, like this map was something that the publisher printed in the physical version of the book. I thought it would be kind of cool to go a step further and say, well, that's nice to look at, but what if I could click on a button here and it would take me to a live version of that map? Okay, so that's what's loading up here right now. I can go ahead and jump around, I can zoom in and out. Again, I've never left the book, I can go right back into it. Okay, you can do that with video. Anything that can basically be placed out on a web page can be brought into a book and turned into a dynamic edition like this. Real quickly in closing, this is the tool that allows you to do that. And I should tell you that the first book we published using this tool was with the author of a book on a battle in the Civil War. He's a 70-plus-year-old retired college professor who, when I showed him the tool at first, he said, look, Joe, I'm a technology Luddite. I don't know what I'm doing with the computer. Are you sure you trust me to do this? So I gave him like 20 minutes of overview. And that night, he and his wife, in 3 hours, basically enriched this whole thing. It was like a 400-page book, and they had some really cool stuff to it. So it's just like painting on the page. This is the Smart Layers editor tool. This is what an author or an editor would use. They would come in, find the page that they want to add an element to, and literally it is like painting on the page. If I wanted to put a website right here, I would left mouse click, drag across, release. Very simple one-screen wizard. I tell it what kind of content I want to drop in, web page, video, audio, so on and so forth. Once I do that, I can pick an icon, or we can get publisher-branded icons in here. I have a URL, that's what it points to out on the web. I can choose from a variety of different types of placement. I would click Save here, and then as soon as I did that, I would check it back into the repository. And the last cool point about this is it's dynamic and live. So if this book was published a month ago and 100 people had bought it, and I just changed the links in here today, and I commit it back into the repository, the next person, everybody that's bought it, including the people that buy it next week, see is the latest version. So it's immediate. You don't have to wait for Apple to approve an app and that sort of thing. It just happens right away. So anyhow, that's just to whet your appetite. If you'd love to talk more about that, it would be great to connect with you. All right, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. So we have time for some questions. We've got some mics that can go around the room. Does anybody? Angela's got a question. Can we get a mic to?
Thank you. That was very interesting. I'm Angela Cochran. I work at the American Society of Civil Engineers, and a lot of what you said I found actually very reassuring. One of the ways that some of this is already happening in scholarly / society publishing is in the least sexy product you can think of, and that's standards.
Okay.
So organizations that publish lots of large standards, for us, we publish the minimum design loads, which are adopted for most building codes throughout the world. It's important to have certain features, and it's also important to make the ebook version available through standard sellers. So there's certain platforms that people are used to buying it from. But we are in this process of developing our deluxe edition online platform version that will only be available from us. It includes a lot of the same kinds of features. There'll be subscription access, there'll be an ability to create groups, to share annotations within the corporation. So I think if we're all looking for examples of where this might be happening in our universe, look to the standards publishers, because that's where a lot of this is starting.
That's a great point. I'm glad to hear that there's already so much activity happening. That's wonderful. Thanks very much. Other questions? Yes, way in the back.
Hi. That's really loud. I'm wondering if when you saw a final product like that book, can someone buy it where they can turn these value-added things on and off?
Absolutely. So remember that button that I showed where you couldn't see them to begin with? That button is a toggle that's always there for the reader to be able to go back to that clean reading experience.
That's the thing that would make it work for my scholarly societies, because we want to reach out to a larger audience, but we don't want to change the original journal articles for scholars who have other access to all these value-added things anyway. We're already doing some of these things in a more static way. We're kind of sexing up some of our ornithology articles, but this would be a better way, because then you automatically can set it up for multiple audiences. So it's very exciting.
Oh, no, thank you. And actually, to your point, and I should have mentioned that, the reason we put that toggle switch in there, we weren't going to do that until we had our first publisher that we were working with that pointed out, hey, our readers are going to want to go back, just like you said, and have that clean reading experience. So we like to pride ourselves on the agile development process, which is what we use. So we're constantly iterating and looking for feedback like that. I should also mention that you were seeing that book through our application in the browser, which I talked about before. Everything's delivered through HTML. But you can use that same enrichment tool to output EPUB 3. So you can push it elsewhere if you choose. Thank you. Any other questions?